Hello, and a warm welcome to tonight's Left Book Club conversation. We're really excited for you to be here tonight for a very important conversation between Palestinian author Ramzy Baroud and academic Dalia Gebrial. My name is Elif, and I curate the program of discussions, dialogue, and other events for the Left Book Club. And support the Left Book Club community to connect with each other and start reading groups. Before we begin, just a little bit about the Left Book Club. As a not-for-profit subscription book club, we specialize in publishing collectible editions of radical books that are only available to our members. Our main focus is on promoting collective learning and political education, which we achieve by providing spaces for people to come together, exchange ideas, and explore new ways of thinking. Our aim is to foster a sense of community to support practical steps towards change. Left Book Club events have featured some phenomenal guests. After this event, feel free to check out the video library on YouTube for discussions engaging with a wide range of political thought and actions. And don't forget to ask your questions on the YouTube live stream chat tonight. If you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click the join button to explore our membership options. Don't forget to follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with our work, and subscribe on the YouTube channel while you're here. And this has never happened on any of our events before, but if the stream does go choppy, please stay with us and we'll make sure to continue running as soon as possible. So we're joined by author Ramzy Baroud and academic Dalia Gebrial tonight as they delve into Ramzy's book, The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story, which through vivid narratives explores life in villages, refugee camps, prisons, and cities, offering intimate insights from those who have lived it. From the current situation, the current ongoing onslaught and genocide in Gaza to long-term solutions, the discussion promises to shed light on the enduring significance of the Palestinian struggle and fight for freedom. Ramzy Baroud is a journalist, author, and editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He is the author of the book that will be tonight's anchor, The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story, and My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Story, and other books. Dalia Gebrial is a writer and an academic looking at race and the digital economy. So without further ado, over to you, Dalia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to be speaking to Ramzy Baroud about his incredible book, The Last Earth. It's almost, I almost want to call it a novel, even though it is a book that is very much based in kind of true stories, and Ramzy is a very esteemed journalist and academic. But as we're going to talk about in the next hour or so, it's a book that breaks a lot of boundaries. It breaks a lot of boundaries between fact and fiction, between art and history, between the individual and the collective. And it's such an honor to be speaking with you today, Ramzy, about this book. I'm going to start with sort of a very simple question. Could you talk to us a bit about what brought you to writing this book? Can you situate it in both kind of your personal, your life history, your career as a writer, an academic and journalist, and more broadly within the Palestinian struggle? If you could situate why this book, why now, both kind of in those three levels.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much, Dalia, for this lovely introduction. Thanks to Left Books and to all the people who are tuning in. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you. I think the starting point, perhaps, of this of the background of the book and pretty much all of my books, which focus on people's history, the story of Palestine from below, as opposed to the academic narration of Palestine, and as opposed to the typical way we perceive and process Palestine, regardless of how we stand on the issue of Palestinian freedom or Palestinian statehood, and all of that, which is highly politicized and quite rigid in the way it's presented. The way I wanted to do it has a lot to do with the fact that I was born and raised in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, particularly in the Nusayrat refugee camp, which is now a daily topic in the news. A family of 15 killed in Nusayrat, 45 killed in Nusayrat, 12 killed in Nusayrat. And you look at the numbers and the families, and you know every single family, because everybody knew everybody else in Nusayrat. And then you start thinking, wait a minute, that was my teacher and his family. That was my neighbor. And it kind of, in retrospect, looking at the book, the argument was that I was trying to make is that Palestine is made of flesh and blood, is made of real people. It's not that of a factional story. It's not about it was not imposed on the political map of the world because of Zionism. It existed pre-Zionism. It's been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's a historical continuation that led to the reality of today. And we are the descendants of that extremely rich history of Palestinian community, generation after generation. When I left Gaza, and I first went to the United States, it felt that the conversation that they were having on Palestine, even if it's told from a supposedly pro-Palestinian point of view, seems to neglect the actual Palestine, the Palestine that I know. And that Palestine is my family, my neighbors, my refugee camp, my Gaza city, my Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah, but also the refugees that came from historic Palestine, their villages, their hopes, their dreams, their political aspirations, their sense of collectiveness, their identity, which is completely separate from having to constantly insert ourselves as some sort of a, marginal characters in a story that's essentially our story. That bothered me greatly. And it's bothered me that many of us as Palestinian intellectuals in the West are quite often pushed into this reaction point of the discourse. Some of the first questions I was asked when I became a student at the University of Washington in Seattle was, why are Arabs trying to throw the Jews in the sea? Why are Arabs anti-Semitic? And you engage in all of these things because they have no frame of reference whatsoever. So you have to play that game. And with time, you realize this is absolutely useless exercise. That's why I switched my entire education and training and writing to write about what I know best, which is my people. And that's why I switched to people's history and then tried to resituate the narrative within something else entirely, starting with my family, my father, my mother, my refugee camp, and eventually the story of so many Palestinian communities across Palestine and in the diaspora as well.
And I think that, it's interesting you referenced there that you sort of started in this academic space. Of course, you also work in you're the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. So you have a lot of experience as well as a journalist. And, these stories are true stories in the sense that you got the kind of bones of the story from interviews that you did with all kinds of different people. But it's written in a very literary way. Like, you add a huge amount of texture and emotional granularity and detail in really evocative ways, in ways that don't read like a sort of traditional historical or journalistic account. Why did you choose to write the book in this way, in this very sort of literary way? Sorry, Ramzy, I think
apologies.
Yeah, no worries.
I think it has a lot to do with the way that we actually narrate stories in Palestine itself. When we tell the stories of amongst ourselves of the martyrs and the Nakba and the stories of the past, we don't tell them as, and you brought the news element into this. 6 Palestinians were killed today when Israel did this, or well, at least in Western news, or Western media, it's Palestinians do not get killed; they just die on their own mysteriously. 3 Palestinians died today in the Shafat refugee camp, and so forth. We don't tell stories that way. We tell the Nakba was conveyed to me not by any Palestinian historian. The Nakba was conveyed to me, or Israeli or anybody else. It was conveyed to me by my grandmother. You know, that she was the storyteller, the narrator of the Nakba. Every story I knew about the Nakba as a child came from my grandmother, who was illiterate, by the way. But it really kind of framed my understanding of our Palestinian reality. In a previous book, my father was a freedom fighter. I spoke about the stories that my grandmother used to tell about the times of the harvest and the snakes that would kind of find their way into the barn where the crops are being kept in. And I speak about a particular snake that every time Grandma Zainab would tell the story, the size of the snake kept growing as well. And towards the end of her life, it was this massive python, even though we know that it was a tiny little snake. And this is something I also incorporated in my style, this kind of magic realism. Because if people do incorporate this kind of storytelling into their reality, then that perception, right or wrong, becomes their reality. And I felt like to be true as a storyteller, to be true to the narrative, you have to respect this component. The story of Marwan, for example, in the book about the ghoul and the ghoul of Beddaras, or Julius rather, this monster who ended up being a very kind mother, and who kind of somehow found her way into the life of the Palestinians. And when the children became refugees, they were so worried. What's going to happen to this ghoul when they were gone? And I incorporated that to other magic realism. Again, stories that Marwan have not only internalized, but she actually truly believed. If you approach this from, fact-checking journalistic sort of way, you're going to say, what is Marwan talking about? This doesn't make any sense. But the fact is that did in fact influence her relationship to the village, to her parents, to the land, to her present reality, and so forth. So all of these factors are very relevant in people's history, and they cannot be subjected to this kind of rigid, dry narration of how we usually look at Palestine as just mere facts. And the facts are enough to make you pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. It just doesn't work that way in everyday reality.
Yeah, and I think that this sort of ties in really interestingly with your theory of history from below and this idea of history from below, because this kind of blended approach is actually quite, it's obviously something that is part of your style, but it's something that this kind of blending of art and the imagination into the realm of the political and the historical is really not only a very key feature of Palestinian political and artistic literature, but also of oppressed people in general. I think when I was reading your book, the most similar text that I could think of was the work of Saidiya Hartman, who really plays with this idea of the interplay between literary fiction and more traditional history. Saidiya Hartman is obviously, she's a historian, but she kind of employs this blended approach that she calls speculative reconstruction, which I feel like you do as well, which is you write these kind of factual stories about people who really existed and who really do exist, but whose ability to exist as full human beings and full people, as full sovereign people, is constantly under attack. And, in her context, she's talking about chattel slavery and the afterlives of the transatlantic slave trade. And in your case, you're talking about the ongoing Nakba of the Palestinians. And I think that kind of pulling in of these non-traditional archives and kind of remaking and bringing into being communities and nationhood and existences that are constantly under attack and are constantly prevented from coming into being in a material way. But part of having it come into being in a material way is through that imaginative and artistic space. And I think that what you talk about, how, you know, your understanding and your history of Palestine was given to you through these stories and through this collective storytelling and this magic realism. It makes me think about the fact that you've called the book a Palestinian story, but it is obviously a collection of stories of individuals with quite different, you know, with very personal stories. You know, we're talking about borders and we're talking about displacement. We're also talking about people who are in love, people who are experiencing these very personal things. How do you think about and relate this idea of these kind of individual stories and these individual and highly personalized stories, and then this idea of a collective Palestinian story, you know, your use of the singular in that term? I'm kind of very interested in that, because in a lot of like Western thinking, the individual and the collective are seen as quite oppositional. So I'm curious about your decision to use the singular whilst actually the meat of the book is very pluralistic.
Exactly. That's an excellent point, actually, Dalia. And I'm just going to answer it in kind of by way of answering it. I'm going to look at it from a different way. At one point, I did a book called These Chains Will Be Broken. And it was the story of Palestinian prisoners from various factions. None of that mattered to me in actually making that story. What really mattered to me is I wanted to convey the story of imprisonment in Israel from an entirely different viewpoint. And that is the viewpoint of the prisoner himself or herself, and not just the prisoner as in someone who is in a state of self-defense. Prove to me that you are not a terrorist, that sort of thing. Because quite often, sometimes we answer questions, even if we are not asked that specific questions, we are almost programmed or indoctrinated to answer a question in a certain way, as a way of humanizing ourselves by first dehumanizing ourselves. So my question to them was, tell me your story as a prisoner, but the way you would want to tell it, as if you are the one telling me what is the core of that story. That story could be your relationship with your mother. It could be a dream you've had. How would you characterize your prison experience? Sadly, some prisoners couldn't get it because they have been programmed to see themselves in a different way. And others got it so beautifully. So at one point, we got together in Istanbul, a group of the prisoners who were freed, to talk about the book a year or two after it was published. They met, and then they realized that one of them was used to be with Hamas, the other with the Islamic Jihad, the third with Fatah. So suddenly there's these differences amongst them, yeah? But I felt uncomfortable for them because, again, suddenly the divided Palestinian discourse, the factionalism. But one of them asked the others a question. He said, "Where were you held?" They said, "We were held at the Jalama." "Oh, so you were tortured by this guy?" And they name an Israeli officer. And the answer was, "Yes." "Where were you at that time?" He said, "I was at this other place after they transferred me, and I was being tortured by someone else." And then suddenly, the three of them were like perfectly on the same political line, sharing the same human experience, tortured by the same guy, asked the same question, and all these factional divides that they had been convinced defined every fiber of their being became completely irrelevant. Now, back to the lost earth. If you look beyond the superficial divides that, and I'm not trying to argue that Palestinian society is perfectly monolith or we have no class divisions and that sort of thing. To the contrary. But if you put the superficial divides, the essence of the story is essentially the same. We are all byproducts of the Nakba. We carry similar memories and similar stories, whether Bisan or Beit Daras, Julis or Batani, Safad or Haifa. Essentially, it's the same. We are motivated by an overbearing emotional baggage that we carry. We know that it's like we are driven to resist, despite the fact that the price of that resistance is so high from an economic point of view, it doesn't make sense. Why would you allow over 100,000 of you to be killed and wounded in order for you to free 4,000. From a mathematical point of view, it doesn't make sense. But for us, it makes sense because the nature of the battle is not about numbers. It's about existence. It's about identity. It's about a collective struggle. So you notice that the first story, and sorry for the language, Shit River in the story, it starts in Syria after the current war, and it ends at the very, very last part of it. The young man is walking, looking for some destination in Europe as a refugee. And then that path is now being walked again by someone who walked it 75 years ago during the Nakba. So what I was trying to say, and it really wasn't any sort of clever manipulation of facts, they were essentially living the same legacy. Those who are living it today, they are continuing a path that started a long time ago. And this is, I mean, yesterday, for example, or the day before, a famous Palestinian artist, Fathi Rabin, died in Gaza. He died in a tent. He is the Nakba artist. You have Mansour and you have Rabin. Rabin died in a tent at the age of 77. He was born in a tent. He died in a tent. So in essence, the first Nakba never really ended. When we say as Palestinians, al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the continuous Nakba, that's not an intellectual term. It's not something that helps us emphasize certain facts that people would know that the right of return is still very significant. No, it is actually the same Nakba. It never finished. The story is essentially the same story. And regardless of the generation that experienced that story, the markers and the definers of that narrative is essentially the same.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful. I think especially when you talk about having all of the prisoners in one space and asking them to tell their story how they would want to tell it. But it was almost like that was such an unfamiliar, that kind of self-narration was so unfamiliar. It was like a muscle that hasn't been exercised because there's this constant sense of being on the defense. So I'd be interested to know what you think about, I mean, obviously we can't not talk about the current crisis, the genocide that is currently underway right now in Gaza. And, though more than anyone that the kind of this question of who gets to tell the story, who gets to narrate, who gets to be a reliable narrator of Palestine has always been, in the West at least, contested and very charged. And that has really heightened in the past 3 months to degrees that even feel unimaginable, even if we've been watching it for so many decades. I wonder how, particularly with the way in which, at least I feel like what has been quite different over the past few months has been the role of Palestinian journalists in Gaza being able to use social media to directly broadcast and narrate their reality to the phones of everyone in the world, basically. How have you found that as a kind of development in this particular moment? And how do you think that relates to this question, again, as you say, of the ongoing assault on the ability of Palestinians to narrate themselves and be considered reliable narrators of their own story?
So, Dalia, you have this kind of the typical conflict that exists in various spaces. In the West is defined as Palestinians don't exist. We are just not capable of narrating anything. We are not trustworthy narrators. To the point that many of us quite often intentionally try to infuse our relationship with other more trustworthy narrator. this is an Israeli historian who said this. This is a Jewish historian. This is a white guy who said this. Therefore, that should give me a little bit of validity to my opinion. I think we have kind of disfigured ourselves and our narratives in the process of doing so. And really, again, this is why the centrality of people's history, because it allows you to tell the story without even having to contend with this intellectual drama. You don't even have. I am telling you the story of an ordinary woman who lived in seemingly ordinary life, but put together, there's something extraordinary about this narrative. And unless you have no heart, basically, you can't ignore it. You can't not see her as such. Now, within the Palestinian discourse, we also have a problem, and we don't talk about it so often because we don't want to appear more divided than the media tells us, that we are. And that is, quite often, those who are telling the story of Palestine are not very credible sources, of Palestine. I mean, the refugees are largely removed from the Palestinian narrative when it comes to the main intellectuals and journalists and narrators of the Palestinian story. Gaza, in particular, has been at a very sub-level of that, because we have always been told this is a conflict over territories. And if it's about territories, well, Gaza doesn't have much territories. We're talking about 181 square miles, 360 or 65 square kilometers. That's not territories. It's just not even enough for the 2.3 million people to be all jammed in there. So there's really no story. There is no significance. There's no centrality to Gaza. And then I made this argument in My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Story, where I argued that if you remove Gaza from the larger, not only the larger Palestinian discourse and larger Palestinian history, but even the body politic of Palestine, I don't think the Palestinian cause would have been the same way. It would have been entirely a different cause. Gaza never stopped resisting. There were never years in Gaza where there was a so-called lull in violence. From the Fidaiyin movement that started as early as 1948-49. And it was essentially a group of peasants who wanted to go back to collect their harvest that they left behind at their homes and their villages in southern Palestine. Then they start getting, being attacked by the settlers. So they start arming themselves, and eventually they became the Fidaiyin movement. And the Fidaiyin movement basically turned into something else and something else. That was decades before Hamas even existed. And eventually the ideologies, there were socialist ideologies, secular ideologies, Islamic ideologies, but essentially the same idea. Gaza finds a way to resist. In other words, Gaza is the capital of Palestinian resistance. And without resistance, there is no Palestine to speak of. So not just myself, the likes of Rifat Al-Arir and many others have done more than their fair share to recenter Gaza, to refocus Gaza within that Palestinian intellectual space as well. Now, I am already, and others, engaged in a conversation. How are we going to convey Gaza after this war is over to ensure that the blood of those intellectuals, poets, academics, and journalists does not go in vain? We can't allow Gaza to be seen as a victim, because Gaza made a choice of resisting. And without the resilience and the resistance going hand in hand, Israel would have not been able to spend 143 or 144 days of war and still fail to achieve any of its objectives. What is the magic of Gaza? What is the secret of Gaza? And to do that, we have now, after this is all over, we can't suppose that Gaza is a marginal space to the larger history of Palestine. Gaza is at the heart of this space. And now it has to be given its dues. Its intellectuals, its writers, its journalists, its bloggers, they would have to be brought back to lead this movement as opposed to be given a token space within a pre-existing intellectual space. I hope I made some sense with that.
No, I think that that's a really beautiful explanation of the particularity of Gaza. And I think what I was thinking when you were talking as well is how, and I don't want to spend too much time in the Western imagination, but I do feel like there's something to be said about how, you talk about victims, right? And there is this sense of there are these boxes that Palestinians and specifically people from Gaza are allowed to fit into. And those are, terrorist and sort of victim. And within that, this idea that there is also intellectual and artistic contribution to this enduring question of like, what does it mean to be human and why are we here? What is our purpose as a world? Is like always neglected. And I think I would really like to hear you talk about, what that political and intellectual theoretical contribution to, thinking about capitalism and modernity from the perspective of Gaza. What does that kind of look like to you? I know that's a huge question. You can't answer that in the, time that we have, but kind of thinking about the cornerstones of what that is, I would really like to hear what you, as someone who's been in this space for so many decades, I would like to hear how you kind of respond to that.
Some of the most intelligent conversations I've ever heard about socialism were actually conducted in my father's living room by a group of his friends. They are all socialists. They were mostly UNRWA teachers, and there is that famous poet and that famous artist, and then they would come together. They would drink mint tea, and they will talk about everything. They are so very engaged. They were, and they still even more now. In issues, I remember when there was a coup in Nicaragua against the socialist government, how angry my father was. It was like it was his personal loss. They were engaged in every matter from the overthrow of Ceausescu in Romania to the socialist revolutions in South America. When Mandela was freed, for example, all the young people, masked young people from various groups led by the socialists, but even Fatah and Hamas, were in the streets congratulating the South African people on the freedom of Nelson Mandela, and all this graffiti on the wall and all this art if you walk within a refugee camp without even have to talk to anyone and just read what they have on the walls, because the walls are the only places in which we were able to express, not freely, mind you, many young people were shot while, if they were caught by Israeli snipers or Israeli special forces while trying to write on the walls. But it was that space that meant to communicate with a single target audience, and that's us, the refugees. But the complexity of those statements, from Ireland to Nicaragua to Cuba to South Africa to Al-Quds to Gaza to everywhere, you would see that the degree of how evolved the Palestinian political discourse within the refugee community. If you walk on the beaches of Gaza, or if you walked before the war, you will find that they have actually gave every chair on the beach where people just go and sit and picnic a name of a village that was destroyed during the Nakba, so that people would remember, and a little piece of information about that village written on the table in front of it, and where it's located on a map. So despite of the isolation, the physical isolation, the geographic isolation, the political isolation, and despite of the siege and the fact that you are supposed to basically try to fight just for mere survival, the cultural life, the political life, the nature of the conversations are extremely evolved in Gaza. And everything that we see in Gaza right now is not this haphazard act that resulted from a group of people who have been pushed to the brink of starvation So they just broke out of the Gaza prison and they did what they did. No, it was an outcome of a sophisticated politicized society who fully understand and know who they are. I have engaged with various youth collectives in Gaza throughout the years. And really, that keeps me sane because every time I talk to them, lecture at various universities in Gaza, listen to them, to their questions, I feel refreshed that we still have our priorities straight and they still know exactly not only who they are within the Palestinian space, but who they are within a larger space of conflicts and struggles and the like. And this idea of the human animal that Yoav Gallant tried to portray of Palestinians, I mean, aside from the racism that is at the core of Zionism since the very beginning, but it also deviates from or distract us from a different conversation, which is the highly intellectual Gaza society that has existed and of course will continue to exist. I mean, I look at galleries and videos coming from our correspondents in Gaza, and there's always a group of kids sitting together with books and they are reading, and teachers in displacement refugee camps in Rafah lecturing and teaching their students. Education is absolutely central in their life and their sense of awareness.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, what really struck me when you talk about, the presence of Nicaragua, the presence of Ireland, the presence of, George Floyd. We've all seen the image of the George Floyd mural in Palestine. And what struck me there was how, you have this place that is through all by land, air, and sea, an attempt to cut it off from the rest of the world. And yet in it is a deep connection to so many different parts of the world who are all struggling against, racialized colonial violence, the same kind of things. And I wonder if, one thing we've particularly seen over the past 3 months is on the flip side of of Israel and the US and Western Europe sort of coalescing around and consolidating their power around this, particular position. We've also seen that is a minority global position, and that the rest of the world, we are seeing movements and marches and organizing around the world, even in places where people are in the grips of their own struggle and in the grips of their own kind of, difficulties. And I wonder if now, you talk about what will happen the day after, this current escalation ends. I wonder do you imagine a kind of a revival of that sort of third worldist connectedness with, in this case, the kind of with Gaza as its sparking point, as its heart, but then also is sort of very much rippling not just through a sort of solidarity lens, but also through a sense of deeply intertwined fates, as it were, happening throughout the global South, which have for the past sort of few decades have been really suppressed by like everything from local elites to kind of identity politics sort of thinking. I would be interested to know what you think about that kind of day after in light of that interconnectedness of struggles.
I can't even tell you how many times, Dalia, I kind of pondered that question. And even though the price is extremely high, that every day of this war costs Palestinians hundreds of lives, so we cannot be disconnected from this reality. But the continuation of that war, the way that solidarity matured over that time, to the point that in my mind, there's no doubt that this is going to turn into something significant and earth-shattering. And this is what I mean by it. I visited South Africa many times in recent years because I strongly believed that the change is not going to come with us begging and pleading in front of the White House. Just simple historical, experience that we have, that never once decolonization or national liberations have ever succeeded because of Western handouts. It just didn't happen. And I challenge anybody to find me a real example that will let us know that it's going to be London or Paris or Madrid even, or Washington, especially Washington, where the salvation for Palestine is going to come from. So I felt that we are spending a disproportionate amount of time and energy asking the wrong person to give us the right thing. And that led to absolutely nothing at the very end. And instead of connecting, of course, with grassroots, activists and work building on intersectional spaces and that sort of thing. But the point is, whenever I went to South Africa, I felt like a country like South Africa is far more capable of actually leading a momentum of change, especially when you know that this is not new. What South Africa is doing is not new, is the outcome of the work of so many fantastic individuals, local South African activists and organizations who worked day and night, and they don't get many accolades for what they have done, but they have been building. The building blocks were all in place before South Africa decided to take Israel to the ICJ. But within Africa itself, I went to Kenya, and I was shocked to see the Israeli influence over Kenya. The very Kenya who has been subjected or subjugated to the same British colonialism, where Palestinians were being tormented by the British during the Mandate years from the early 20s until 1948. And yet, the kind of Israeli propaganda, Western propaganda, people would stand in the National Theater of Nairobi and they would ask me such questions such as, why are Palestinians using terrorism and that sort of thing? And it's just mind-boggling knowing that they are using the exact same terminology that the West has used against their ancestors and their parents and grandparents when they were fighting British colonialism. So it seems that we have lost something important in the global south. And I always start with self-blame, that we Palestinians with Madrid and then with Oslo abandoned the global south. We were told it doesn't matter. The collapse of the Soviet Union has changed the very definition of solidarity. The global south is no longer an important geopolitical actor. You need to go somewhere else and try to solve your problem somewhere else. And that left a lot of space for Israel in the global south to move about. When Netanyahu went to Africa for the first time in 2016, he made that infamous speech where he congratulated himself for bringing Israel back to Africa, as if Israel ever belonged to Africa. And he succeeded indeed in turning Israel into an observer member state in the African Union and all the rest, right? Now, what is the language that's coming from Africa when you hear what the Ugandan ambassador or envoy to The Hague said, talking about Palestine and referencing the German genocide against his country and creating all of these historical connections? It's as if we are still living the heyday of national liberation movements. And we don't need the Soviet Union for it. We don't need a great power to back us up. We can actually achieve that in our own way by building these kind of connections. So it is incredible. It is incredible, and knowing as well, and I'm going to finish with that, knowing as well that within that global South space, we have seen the revival of indigenous movements around Palestine. And I've been to particularly Hawaii, the Zulu-speaking people in South Africa, the Maori people in New Zealand, the indigenous people of Australia, and the energy that exists there is not sentimental energy. It is real, that we can only survive as indigenous people if we unify our ranks and work together. I think Gaza is going not only to be the spark, I think it's going to be the rally cry that would allow us to come back together in full force to reinsert ourselves at our causes, our struggles, back at the heart of global agendas, as used to be in the past.
Yeah, I think the thing that you said about, I mean, you put it very powerfully, this idea of the abandonment of the global South, I think is one thing that I kind of, and this idea that maybe if we appeal to the West, then that's how liberation or freedom can come. I think on the flip side of that, I think that a lot of people in the West have learned a very hard lesson over the past 3 months about their own freedom and their own democracy, and the fact that it's overwhelmingly clear that the people in the US, the people in Britain, the people in Western Europe do not consent to this genocide and do not want this genocide to happen in their name. And yet I think they have been faced through the lens of Gaza with their very own powerlessness. So in a sense, that reckoning is also happening internally as well. You talk about visiting South Africa and seeing that this work was ongoing beforehand. And obviously, we have these very hyper visible ruptures, like South Africa taking the ICJ to court, taking Israel to the ICJ, sorry. What does that work outside of those ruptures look like from your experience?
And that's usually the story untold, because that doesn't make it to the headline news. When a group of, for example, poor workers from some suburb in Pretoria get together to talk about why Palestine is important for them, for their existence, for their own cause, finding the common grounds, and they get together and they drink a cup of coffee and they issue a press release and they go to a protest and then they move on. It seems irrelevant. It seems unimportant. But it's that kind of discussion, is that kind of mobilization, is that kind of work that happens usually, in the shadows or in the margins, that when time calls for it, they are the ones who start the mobilization. So when the war is over, and it will be over, there will be the time for, of course, for Gaza and for Palestine to reconstruct our own priorities, to find the common grounds once again, and to rise as one unified single Palestinian nation. No West Bank, Gaza, Palestine 48, no Hamas, Fatah, one single group of people called the Palestinian people with one flag and one slogan. But I think there's going to be a lot of reconstruction happening as well. The last Friday, something very interesting happened. And again, the media did not cover it at all. And that is the first time in years in which all Yemenis in the north and in the south protested in their millions around a single cause, and that's Gaza. And that's the first time they actually went to the streets together, having the same chant and the same demand. Shia, Sunni, very little talk of that now, because you have the various groups from throughout the Middle East also fighting for the same cause. So it is this work, a lot of this work that at times appear insignificant, that would eventually make all the difference. And quite often you see some of the people at the ICJ, for example, within the South African team, and you start thinking, I've seen that guy. He was at that talk when we were told before he had that position, and so forth and so on. So you have to build these kind of connections, and you have to make yourself also available to be part of their struggle and of their cause, because they also need you. They also have their own fight. We need to invest in this, and we need to invest in a protracted and sustainable sort of way, because when the time calls for it, and it could be a time of genocide, then we need all of these connections, all of these people to build a global movement. And I'm proud to say that we actually have. I mean, we've been talking for such a long time about when will this threshold be reached? When will this critical mass be achieved for a paradigm shift? We've been talking about it as if it's just boring intellectual subject amongst ourselves for years. And we are actually living that moment. And I know it's very difficult to celebrate that moment when children are starving to death, but that moment is actually being reached as we speak.
So for my final question, I actually want to go back to the novel and talking about reaching places. You've talked, the name of this book is The Last Earth. It obviously harks back to a Mahmoud Darwish poem. And the phrase comes up in, I think, basically each story. And it comes up in different ways. Sometimes it's, a place in a dream. Sometimes it sounds like it might be a physical place that the characters are trying to reach to. Sometimes it's a metaphor. I want you to just tell me what the idea of the last earth means to you and what it represents both in this book, but also more broadly for the political moment that we're in.
So the last earth has double meanings in the book. There's the last earth that is the perception of that safe space in which that particular Palestinian refugee, as a representation of a generation or of a large number of Palestinians within that generation, is hoping to reach. He wants to go to a place where it could be his last earth, his oasis, his peace of mind will finally be achieved there. But ultimately, always in the background, there's a different last earth, and that's Palestine itself. So no matter what's his name? Khaled Abdel Ghani would, for example, is trying to find that last earth from Syria to Turkey to Greece, goes to various other countries, ends up being in Austria. Ultimately, he was not seeking the right place. Ultimately, the place he was looking for was Palestine itself. So that is the thing. We are always looking. We are always, in a sense, even if you are home, you're homeless. If you are a Palestinian, because your home is somewhere else, and you can't emotionally move on. Maybe some refugees do, and many do, but they can't move on because the initial injustice that led to their diaspora and to their torment generations ago remains in place, actively happening as we speak. More tent, more deaths, more wounded, more maimed, more loss, more denial of rights, more everything. So no matter how much we try to escape into some kind of an imagined last earth, the last earth is always Palestine. And this is the functionality of people's history. People's history is not emotional, is not about poetry and sentiments. People's history is very real and very functional. A lot of people don't understand why haven't Palestinians escaped. I mean, they've done it before. A few years ago, they broke the wall with Egypt and they ran into Sinai. Every single one of them came back. They just wanted fuel and food, and they came back, right? So they've done it before. They can do it if they want to, but they haven't, because they know, this generation knows that their last earth is Gaza, and it's the West Bank, and it's Palestine 48, and it's the right of return. So that's why every single one of them, we're not going anywhere. You can kill us all. We're not going anywhere. So they kind of wrote the final chapter to the last earth without writing it. They know that their last earth is Gaza and it's Palestine, and again, they're just not going to go anywhere.
I think I'm going to leave it there on that really powerful note. Ramzy, thank you so much for being in conversation with us today, and thank you to Left Book Club for hosting it. I would implore everyone to subscribe to Left Book Club so you can also get your hands on this really beautiful book. I really, really enjoyed it and found it incredibly moving. So thank you so much for hosting us today.
Thank you, Dalia, and thank you, Left Book. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dalia and Ramzy. I think, I don't know how you've done it, but in about 50 minutes, there was so much covered, and so in such a beautiful and rich way. And this is what we wanted to try and do with this event is, considering what is happening right now, of course, very heavily in Gaza, but actually across Palestine as a whole. It's very obviously important to be discussing those issues, but there's more to Palestine and there will be, of course, in the future. So we really wanted to have a rich conversation about all of that, and what the struggle for freedom means for many, many peoples, of course, in this case, primarily the Palestinian people. So thank you very much for tuning in, everyone. And as I said at the beginning, please follow us on social media, and feel free to watch all the other events we've done on our YouTube library. Another thing, another important part of the work of Left Book Club is developing a large network of reading groups, which we're very proud to already have a network of, and we would like to expand that. And actually, many of the reading groups that we support, we're also very happy to have seen that in the last couple of months, they've been picking up Ramzy's book to read locally. So if you please check our website in the event section, all the reading groups are posted there. If there isn't one in your area and you would like to start one, feel free to email me. My email is in the events section as well, and I'm very happy to support that process. And thank you very much, and see you next time.